Hi everyone, welcome to the very first video for the WOW History channel. My name is Ron Guth. The reason I call this the WOW History channel is because I do auction write-ups and cataloging for early American history auctions here in San Diego, California. And in the course of my work, I run across documents and old historical items that when I see them and I read them and I write them up, I say, wow, could this be true? I mean, did they really say this, or did this really happen? Because the things that we learn in school have been run through a filter of the last 200 years here in America, 200 plus years. And so some things have been, not necessarily censored, but everything is written through a lens or a filter that takes some things out or eliminates things, so that when you go to the source documents, you say, wow, that is not exactly what I'm being taught. When I came up through school, high school, college, I did not like history. I thought it was very boring, very repetitive. You had to learn dates and names. Was not very interested in it at all. Now, most of my life, most of my career has been involved in numismatics, which is coin collecting, and I've done a tremendous amount of research and history in that area. For many, many years, I also wrote up or cataloged coins for various companies for their sales catalogs. So I did a lot of research, and I learned how to find information when it was not generally available. The whole thing about historical research or numismatic research is knowing where to go to find the information. So as I catalog coins, it's only natural that you learn about geography, history, politics, economics, other subjects that are related to coins but not directly related to coins. So a friend of mine who had a company out here in San Diego, I've already mentioned it, Early American Numismatics, for a while I was writing catalog descriptions for him, and he says, do you know anything about historical items? And I said, no, I mean, I didn't like history. I don't really have much of a background. He said, well, you're a good writer, and let's see if you can figure out how to write these items up. It's really just selling the item. So I came out to California a couple times and sat down with these historical documents. And I'm talking about things like, George Washington signed documents, photographs that are signed by, Civil War generals like Robert E. Lee, just this amazing stuff. It was like being in a museum, and I got to physically handle these documents that, most people never see. So in the course of writing those things, I came across these things, as I mentioned, that were just really shocking to me. I go, wow, I never understood this to be the case. This is not what I learned in school. So that's why I've titled it WOW History. This is going to be an educational channel. I want to bring up every week. I'm going to bring up a new item that I find that is very interesting, or maybe a little controversial, politically incorrect, things that I think you'll be amazed, and when you hear their story, you'll also go, wow, that's not the way it was taught to me. So let me give you a couple examples of things that were wows to me. When you look at some of these early documents, like for instance, the other day I cataloged a proclamation that was given by John Adams in the early 1800s while he was president. And these are printed on what they call broadsides or broadsheets, which is a single piece of newspaper, maybe 13 by 8 or 9 inches wide. And they are just a single-sided, and basically it was just something that was printed and that would be tacked up onto a tree or a wall or a bulletin board, if they had such a thing back then, so that the people could read it. And this is the way that news was transmitted back then. So this is a proclamation that John Adams gave in early 1800s, early in the year. And the proclamation was on the third Thursday of November, we're going to proclaim that as a day of thanksgiving for America. And when you read this document, clearly they were setting up a Thanksgiving Day. But when you read the document, there's so many references to God and providence and the blessings that have been bestowed upon America. You read it and you go, oh my God, they could never write that today. They could never get away with it. They would be run out of town, separation of church and state, that sort of thing. But when you read it, you say, this is really amazing what they were writing. And when they talk about the thanks that they're giving for the blessings of America, it's just amazing how sincere they are. This is not pandering to a particular base. They're just declaring that here in America, we are going to celebrate the blessings that we received from God. So this was an interesting thing to say, mostly because it was like, this is not something that we would expect to see today. They would be castigated, run out of town, whatever, told to be quiet, canceled, if you will. So this is the sort of thing that you see. Then there's items that have interesting stories. Like, for instance, in the Civil War, that was when America started the draft. The very first federal draft was during the Civil War. And the way that was administrated was the federal government looked at each state and their population, and they said, we're going to give you a quota of men that you're required to send to us to fulfill the ranks of the Union Army. So each state would get a quota. They said, let's say they had to have 5,000 men. The provost marshal would come into a town, and he would survey the town and find out how many of the men in the town were able-bodied or of the proper age to go into service. And they would make a list of these men, and they would publish them and make sure that they're accurate. And then they would have a lottery, and a list of names would be prepared for enlistment. And if your name was on that list, you were drafted and you had to go. Well, you either had to serve, or you could hire a substitute, which means you could go, Jim, will you take my place if I give you $300? Or you could pay $300 to the government and get what they call a commutation money receipt. And what this was basically you could buy your way out of the draft. Now, $300 back in the Civil War era was a huge amount of money, and only the very wealthy could afford to buy these commutation money receipts. So what happened was, in New York in 1865, the poor people who could not afford to buy the commutation money receipts, they rioted. And there are books about the New York City draft riots, and they literally tore the town up, killed a bunch of people, and they just rioted for many days until the army was called in to quell the riot. You rarely, I never learned about this in history in school, and never learned about it at all. It's just something that might have been mentioned in passing, but never really was, the story was never told. So this is something you go, wow, this is the first draft. If you're a rich kid, you could buy your way out of the draft. And then the fact that you could hire a substitute was also a very interesting aspect of it. Here's another interesting story. In 1915, there was a Panama Pacific Exposition held in San Francisco. And this was a big, big deal. They built all kinds of buildings just for this exposition. People came from all over the world, and it was to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. Well, to prepare for the celebration, one of the things that they did was they took the Liberty Bell, the very famous Liberty Bell from Philadelphia. They put it on a special train bed, and they hauled it across the country from Philadelphia to San Francisco, and along the way they would stop and people would come out to see the Liberty Bell. Now, can you imagine if you've been to Philadelphia and you've seen the Liberty Bell? It is very carefully guarded, protected. There is no way you can get anywhere near it to touch it or see it. I mean, it's sheltered. Can you imagine today if the Liberty Bell was put on a train and carted across the country? I mean, it's something that would never happen today. So you say, wow, I cannot believe that they actually did this. And it's just a great story. And there's all sorts of picture postcards that you can purchase that show the Liberty Bell with crowds around it in Davenport, Iowa, and the various cities that it stopped. And then when it went to San Francisco, they festooned it with all kinds of flowers, and there are images from the Panama Pacific Exposition that show the Liberty Bell on display there. So that's another wow sort of historical moment. A couple others are, if you think about the Civil War, what happened after the Civil War? What happened to all the people that were in the army? What happened to the generals? And you see that they found places to go. They found life after the Civil War. And one of the areas that they went was in the service of the government and in the army out west, where they were, their job was to suppress the Plains Indians who were refusing to go onto reservations that the U.S. government had created for them, and to quell unrest, to make sure that the white settlers that were invading the Indian lands were safe and protected. So you'll see people like famous generals like William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip Sheridan. These men were instrumental in quelling the Plains Indians and forcing them onto reservations. And you say to yourself, well, Sherman was, the one, the general that, marched through the South and divided it and conquered it. And here he is now being repurposed as a instrument for subjugating the American Indians. And Philip Sheridan, he's the one who's famous for saying, the only good red man is a dead red man, or something like that. He's alleged to have said it. Historians will give you a different take on that. But then you also talk about how were they able to subjugate the Plains Indians? Well, one of the ways that they did it was to kill the buffalo and literally starve the Indians onto reservations. And when we're talking about killing the buffalo, we're talking about herds of millions upon millions of animals that were just literally slaughtered and left to rot on the plains, where the American Indians used almost every part of the buffalo for hides, food, medicine. Virtually nothing was left to waste, but the white settlers or the people in the army, or they would have trains. They would have trains where people would come out for a buffalo hunt, and they would literally sit on the train and shoot through the windows and kill buffalo by the thousands. There are images of piles of hides that are like a mountain. They're just hundreds, thousands of hides that were taken from the buffaloes. So this is another wow thing. We know that the buffalo have been decimated. We just know that, because they're not here anymore. Where they used to cover the plains, now they're in small little herds scattered around the United States. So when you read this, you say, wow, I can't believe how brutal that this approach was towards the Indians, and how it actually happened. And it was all done by the U.S. Army and by generals who had achieved fame and fortune in the Civil War. Another wow story is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom has become a very negative term when referred to anyone. Uncle Tom is like a traitor, a traitor to his race, a backstabber, whatever. It's just very he's received a very negative connotation over the years. Why is that? If you read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, you'll come away with a completely different conclusion. Two things about Uncle Tom's Cabin. One, it is also extremely religious. There are all kinds of references in there to Christianity, kindness to your fellow man, and that sort of thing. And the good guy in the story is Uncle Tom. And so somehow over time, that has all been changed, and Uncle Tom has gotten a negative rep, and we're going to be talking about him in the future as well to find out why that is. Here's something else that I learned just recently. I was reading a book called The History of America, which was actually written during the American Revolution, prior to the America winning the war. And of course it was English-centric. It was written by an Englishman. But he talked about the history of Virginia and Maryland and the history of America in general. And apart from the fact that he recognizes that there were people that came to America prior to Christopher Columbus, they may not have settled here, but they visited America prior to Christopher Columbus. He also talks about the English and their involvement with settling the colonies. And what was really surprising to me was that England was sort of like, they came to the game late. Whereas Portugal and Spain had these, great sailing nautical people and ships that could come across the Atlantic, the English really didn't have much. And it took them a while to get with the program and actually send someone over. And the first one was Cabot. And Cabot came over, and instead of going the southern route to like the Caribbean and South America, he decided to take a more northerly route. And so he ran into the North America, like Newfoundland and the northeast of America, as opposed to going to the southern route. Now, he did not settle. He did not find gold and silver. He didn't find much here in America. So when he came back to England, it wasn't like there were new riches, and they just didn't get excited about it like the Spanish and Portuguese did. So what really was the wow moment for me was the fact that it took 65 years for the English to come back over to America. And that's when they established Roanoke Colony, which was a failure. And then shortly thereafter, they came back and settled Jamestown. But 65 years, I'd never realized that. I thought everybody was coming over at the same time. They're all just, trying to get land, trying to plant a flag, trying to gain possessions and that sort of thing, but that's not the case. So it was a very interesting revelation. In the scope of history, it just shows the relationship of these various countries and how America was actually formed. So England, of course, came out on top in the end. They got all the 13 colonies that were formed the United States. So it all ended up well for them, but they were just a little bit late coming to the game. So these are the kind of stories that I want to bring to you each week, and I hope that you'll subscribe to the channel, like it once you see some of the things that I'm going to be posting, and I hope that you'll enjoy what I'm putting up. And I hope that when you hear it and when you read it, that you'll also say, wow, that is not what I learned, or not something that I would ever expect to have happened. In other words, I didn't see that coming. So I hope to see you again soon, and thank you very much for watching, and see you next week. Bye-bye.